they'll be able to find the drone operator and harass them. And this isn't to discount the fact that we know this has happened, not with remote ID, but we know drone operators have been harassed. We get the information just as well as you folks do in the communities.
Remote ID in the current form within the United States will not work. The FAA surely must know it will not work. Today, I'll explain why, but also stay tuned because I will discuss the elephant in the room of remote ID that many people do not talk about and why it has a unique power over regulations. The drone and model aircraft hobby used to be fairly loosely regulated in terms of a pastime and profession, with rules increasing as the popularity of camera drones increased. You now have an incredible increase in the level of proposed sub 400 foot airspace use, and as such we need to find ways for everyone to share the skies. Firstly, a little bit of background. Everywhere you look, there is seemingly good advice and careful warnings about what makes a good law and what is good regulation. The Oxford University Press publishes a book on the topic by Robert Baldwin and others called Understanding Regulation, Theory, Strategy and Practice. Chapter 3 of that book examines what makes a system of regulation good, acceptable, or in need of reform. It discusses 5 criteria for good regulation: whether the action or regime is supported by authority, whether there is an appropriate scheme of accountability, whether procedures are fair, accessible and open, whether the regulator is acting with sufficient expertise, and whether the action or regime is efficient. There are also more widely accepted characteristics of a good law. The law must be in the interests of the people. The law must not discriminate, meaning the law must be applied equally to everybody. A good law must be reasonable. The law should not be too harsh or rigid, and a good law should not suppress the people. All seems quite reasonable, doesn't it? Remote ID is something which we have been discussing for a long while here on this channel, and with the recent failed court action attempting to overturn the plans, soon within the United States under FAA regulations, your new drone will come ready to transmit certain data. This will controversially include the location of the remote pilot. One significant part here is that the data will be available via an app to anyone in a similar way to Flight Radar 24 that shows lots of information on the aircraft that are flying across the skies. Although it should be remembered that this will be a localized version, so really Flight Radar 24, but for your neighborhood. I have met and spoken to many US drone flyers, both recreational and commercial, who support the need for a good remote ID system. This will then allow many advances, including beyond visual line of sight flights and advances in automated flight. Progress is good, and the economy it could unlock and the jobs it could create are of course fantastic, but only if handled correctly. The main issue that so many US drone flyers are against is the public accessibility of the data. Now, back in August 2021, on a live stream hosted by the FAA, Danielle Corbett of the administration demonstrated to me why it is that the FAA are so out of touch with the issue. Listen to this short clip from that show.
But it also, just normalizes operations. When we see planes flying around in the sky, we don't question whether or not they're supposed to be there or whether they're being operated in compliance with anything. We're used to seeing the paint on it. We see the N numbers. There's just a sense of comfort that the system is working the way it's supposed to be. And I think this is a step in that direction. It's a step in getting everybody on board doing the same thing. And with that, we get, the opportunity for more advanced operations. So we already said, this is the next step towards complex operations, such as some operations over people, maybe beyond visual line of sight, maybe the UTM, the unmanned traffic system. So it's kind of the next logical step in moving the system along to a controlled and normalized system.
Essentially what Danielle is saying here is that remote ID and having the information available publicly brings drone operators in line with general aviation and crewed flight. You are indeed able to publicly access the data on where an aircraft is at any time. We all know that. It will even show you the registration details, intended flight path, and of course, being crewed aviation, where the pilot is. Where Danielle's point that bringing drone flight in line falls down is one of security. Although I know precisely where any commercial flight is and where it's going to land, simply by looking it up on a flight tracker app, I cannot get to that aeroplane, that flight crew or aircraft. Airports are designed with lots of security and checks to ensure the aircraft and the flight crew are understandably kept safe and secure. In terms of being able to track the location of a drone pilot on a public app, there is no security and no defense for the remote pilot whatsoever. They are, once found, at risk of confrontation or far worse. The incredible thing here is that the FAA publicly admit that they know drone confrontation is an issue already. And in this clip, they clearly state that they're aware of the issues.
And I'm going to take it because if I mess it up, Danielle, you can help me redo my resume as I'll be looking for some new work here. But this question comes in many, many different forms. And it's probably a question that people may have been shouting at their computer for the last 25 minutes. But we get a lot of comments, a lot of questions around this topic, which is the premise is remote ID is dangerous for drone pilots. And the public is going to have now access to where a drone operator is standing, or at least where the control station is, or where the drone took off from. And they'll be able to find the drone operator and harass them. And this isn't to discount the fact that we know this has happened, not with remote ID, but we know drone operators have been harassed. We get the information just as well as you folks do in the communities. If it does get to the other side, the FAA will have to address that accordingly, perhaps with some different rule changes toward the future. But ideally, we don't want you to be harassed at all. So we're working towards that goal and trying to educate and communicate first. So I understand, and not just myself, everyone at the FAA hears you loud and clear about the concerns that you folks have with regarding location identification and people being able to find you. But we're working on the front end of that and trying to educate first. And then if that doesn't work, we'll explore other means.
So despite knowing that confrontations happen already and referring the issue instead to law enforcement to sort out, it appears the FAA are willing to potentially put remote pilots at risk, simply stating that if it becomes a problem later, they'll make changes. To me, this is like saying, I know that driving my car into a wall is probably going to hurt me, but despite this evidence and common sense knowledge, I'm going to drive the car into the wall anyway. And I'm only going to change my driving habits once I'm hurt. In the same show, the FAA also stated that they have 2 years from the time of the live show that was broadcast last year to educate the public as to the good use cases for drones and why they shouldn't fear them. Now, a year on, and I'm aware of some of this work in this area, but have they done enough to bring the public on side enough to remove that risk of confrontation? Let me know your thoughts on that particular part in the comments below. Have you seen much of a public campaign from the FAA? Though surely applying any good practice in how to regulate and legislate shows that remote ID in this form with this glaring issue is not good regulation. Although the US courts have recently found it does not infringe on personal rights and privacy, it does mean, arguably, that remote pilots would be unfairly regulated. Before I come on to the main reason remote ID is doomed to failure, let us talk for a minute, as promised, about the elephant in the room. That elephant is security, and more specifically, the concerns held by those agencies and departments tasked with protecting the public from the very specific threats. In this world where a van or a commercial jet can sadly be used as a powerful destructive weapon, we have to concede that in the wrong hands, drones can pose a security threat. The many pictures and video from Ukraine of consumer drones being weaponized doesn't really help the image much. However, although the threat is limited and thankfully a lot of hard work by those tasked with protecting us works, the small amount of potential threat there is gives a lot of power, unproportionately so, to those wishing to regulate against the potential for extreme bad actors to use consumer drones this way. Although extremely rare, this kind of use could have, of course, a devastating impact. I'm not agreeing with it, I'm not disagreeing with it. This is just worth pointing out as it does directly contribute to the existing FAA remote ID final rule. What is the main reason I believe that remote ID as it stands with localized identification of a remote pilot's location doomed to failure? Why will it potentially have a damning knock-on effect to any UTM system that relies on it and therefore the future of the sub 400 foot airspace? You only have to look at the world of FPV for an answer. Here we have a niche of the drone UAS sport, hobby and profession that has been around for a good bit longer than the consumer camera drones that are now so popular. What you'll also have within the FPV is a very high level of non-compliance to regulation. In the United States and here in the UK, when you're engaged in flying an FPV drone purely using the goggles to navigate, you are required to have a spotter with you. I would personally say, and don't think you'd blame me for saying this, that pretty safe to state really, that the vast majority of FPV flight is carried out without a spotter. Now, with this non-compliance, we really haven't had many issues. The safety record of consumer grade drones and FPV is excellent. So the non-compliance in terms of spotters doesn't really cause too many problems for us. However, if you launch a remote ID system that will have many proposed users looking to either bypass the system entirely or spoof it, then you are knowingly walking into a system of regulation that will not be complied with. How do you then build a UTM system to allow further use of the sub 400 foot airspace without reliably knowing what is already flying in that same airspace? Does this sound like good regulation? It will end up needing far more counter drone systems, and you'll need to have sensors covering the entire airspace to know what is actually happening. So in theory, the very remote ID system that's been put into place to identify lower airspace users could itself end up needing further systems and expense to prop it up just because of this one particular issue. Here in the UK, we have a trial starting which kind of turns the concept of remote ID on its head a little. Rather than each drone needing to be fitted with any sensors or give out any of the pilot's information to the public, Project Skyway is building a test corridor where everything in the unified airspace is watched by sensors, and then the commercial drones being flown along that corridor are controlled around the existing air users. This means Jim with his Mini 3 can follow the drone rules and won't even know the corridor exists or need to do anything at all to comply. Now, this is just a trial and time will tell if it works. I'm not saying it's the answer. What I am saying is that surely if there are systems out there which appear to give the required level of airspace vision to run BVLOS and automated flights without impacting at all on the existing hobby and commercial drone flyer, then surely these should be pursued before you place extra burden, both financially and in understanding terms, on what is an important hobby and profession to many people. My fear is that with this form of remote ID coming into effect in the United States, we will see a lot of time and expense being outlaid in the future to either force lower airspace aviation to cram themselves into this narrow way of working, or other regulation and systems, as I said before, needed to prop this one up. However, the one simple issue that will probably clip the wings of remote ID and the benefits it looks to bring the world of future flight is non-compliance. It will be a very long time until all the drones owned now without the need to comply are all dead and in the parts bin, let alone the resurgence of self-build drones I think this regulation will actually bring. Let me know your thoughts on this topic in the comments below, and whether or not you believe, as I do, non-compliance could be one of the most significant issues that could bring about the failure of remote ID. Sean out.